So the Atlantic Council, which is a right-wing neoconservative think tank, and which sort of has a lot of say in what's allowed on Twitter and on Facebook, they have this anonymous article that they put out, and it's really arrogant, as you would expect from the US national security state, the US empire. It's really, really arrogant towards China, and I don't know if you've noticed, but China is becoming more defensive toward the US because the US is threatening, basically has been sabre-rattling towards China for some time now. And so this article in the Atlantic Council, I just want to share with you something Max Blumenthal said about it, and then I'll share with you the little pieces of that article which just show the level of hubris, of arrogance, of entitlement, and just a host of things that you think, when is this going to end? Like, when this arrogance, where is it going to end? So Max Blumenthal said, as an articulation of hostile Beltway consensus, the anonymous Atlantic Council paper urging a new Cold War on China confirms the maintenance of total hegemony as the key driver of US policy, with, quote, values, end quote, and human rights deployed as mere PR weapons. The anonymous author sees China's embrace of Russia as a major threat to US hegemony and urges a thawing with Russia to divide the two. This strategy was at the core of the triangular diplomacy conceived by Henry Kissinger. By the way, Henry Kissinger, does he ever end with his meddling, his war-mongering? The strategy was at the core of the triangular diplomacy conceived by Henry Kissinger, the longest-serving Atlantic Council board member. The Atlantic Council, quote, made the decision to keep the author of the paper anonymous, given the extraordinary significance of the author's insights. So in the article, this is one of the parts of it, it says, effectively reinforcing US alliances is critical. Dividing Russia from China in the future is equally so. Allowing Russia to drift fully into China's strategic embrace over the last decade will go down as the single greatest geostrategic error of successive US administrations. I've got news for the US empire. Any country that is in the crosshairs of US empire, if they have any sense whatsoever, they will embrace one another in an alliance. And, because you can pick you can pick countries off one by one if they're not in solidarity with other countries. But if they're all aligning with one another against US empire, they have a much better chance of being able to defend themselves. So Russia and China, it would be a natural alliance. So good luck trying to break that alliance. And I'm going to show something just after this, which is about Iran and Dr. Mirandis, who is an Iranian. He's from the University of Tehran in Iran, and he talks about the chemical weapons that were used against Iran, and how Iran has been in has the propaganda about Iran returning fire with chemical weapons, which never happened, and how nobody came to their aid, and how the corporate media were completely silent during that time when Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran via Saddam Hussein at the time, who, by the way, at that time was backed by the US until he became inconvenient. So that's also very disturbing. How chemical weapons were used on Iran and everyone was silent. Anyway, so back to this article. Another part of this Atlantic Council article: given China's significant and growing quote comprehensive national power, end quote, some may question how this can realistically be achieved. The overriding political objective should be to cause China's elite leadership to collectively conclude that it is in the country's best interests to continue to operate within the existing US-led liberal international order rather than build a rival order, and that it is in the party's best interest, if it wishes to remain in power at home, not to attempt to expand China's borders or export its political model beyond China's shores. I mean, the absolute arrogance of the US telling China and threatening China, basically, that they shouldn't be making alliances with Russia. They shouldn't be China has already surpassed the US as an economic power. But this is the US empire is just struggling to maintain this unipolar world, basically full spectrum dominance. That's what it wants, and is struggling desperately to basically remain a unipolar power. And it's become a multipolar world, and it cannot abide by that. You may have heard that Donald Trump is probably starting a third party, and it's called the Patriot Party. And you always know when there's conservatives call things the Patriot Party or America something or freedom something, that it's always sort of dodgy. But of course, this Patriot Party is something that Donald Trump wants, and the good thing about starting this third party is that it'll probably completely destroy the GOP. The only problem with that is that it will then, of course, allow the Democratic Party to romp in elections if there's no other party besides those three parties. And so, not that they try at the present time to do anything for the people, but they certainly won't if they're going to romp in, because Donald Trump will take 15% of the vote or more, and that will be the end of the GOP. So that's a good thing. But then, as I say, the negative outcome is that the Democratic Party will be romping in if there's no other challenges in this pretend democracy they have in the US. So anyway, and Donald Trump has set up this office at Mar-a-Lago, apparently, where he's calling it the office for the former president. I mean, this stuff, you couldn't make it up. And that's where he's going to be doing all his announcements. It's this sort of, I mean, it's sort of beyond, it's kind of a parody almost. He's become a parody. So we'll be hearing all about what he's going to do in the future from this office for the former president. But I think that Donald Trump, because he'll be after all these different GOP politicians that didn't support him during this Stop the Steal thing that he was doing and all of that. So he's threatening to primary all these different ones that didn't help him, do the basic coup or whatever he was trying to do, the insurrection. So it's going to be interesting to watch this mess as it unfolds. So, the GOP helped create a kind of monster. The Democratic Party helped create this monster too. Hillary Clinton, with her Pied Piper strategy, the campaign did a Pied Piper strategy to help elevate Donald Trump. The corporate media, of course, I don't know if they thought they were going to help Donald Trump win, but he was bringing in loads of money for the corporate media, and they've helped create Donald Trump as well. So all these different factors have helped create Donald Trump. And then, of course, Joe Biden has failed with his promise to deliver $2,000 immediately upon election, which means that there is a competent fascist rubbing his hands together for 2024 if he keeps abandoning the public and keeps lying as he did before the election and failed to deliver promises. You can see there'll be a competent fascist ready in the wings to romp in 2024. So anyway, if I haven't already shown you this clip from the Grey Zone with Dr. Professor Mirandis, talking about Iran and the chemical weapons used on them, please stay tuned, and it's very interesting, and it's very, very sad, and something we should all be aware of. Thanks for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Fancy Signals from Viga. Stay tuned.
Just a few things. One is that during the Iraq War, as Gaz pointed out, the Iraqi armed forces under Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons extensively and repeatedly and regularly. And these chemical weapons and the capability to use them were provided by European countries allied to the United States, NATO countries, and the United States was involved as well. Not only did they provide him with the ability to produce chemical weapons, but they also provided him with military intelligence to use those weapons effectively, and they provided him with political cover at the UN Security Council to get away with using these chemical weapons. I personally survived 2 chemical attacks. Nerve gas during the Khaybar operations. This was the first time that chemical weapons were used very extensively. 2 Iraqi jets bombed our positions, and I had great trouble breathing, as was the case with my friends. And back then, Iran was prevented from even purchasing gas masks. So the gas mask that I had was smuggled into Iran, purchased, I think, from North Korea or some other place, and it was not very good. It was not very useful. Later on in the war, I was a victim of a second chemical attack during the last days of the war. It was the final Iraqi offensive in the war, and they used mustard gas, which was very it's really bad. People are still dying today as a result of mustard gas. Many have a slow death. Many have died over the last 3-4 decades, and people like myself are more susceptible to the problems that COVID-19 can create for the lung, for your lungs. So people like me are it's more dangerous for us to get COVID-19 than for other people, because of course I got off rather. I wasn't severely injured, but there are those who were severely injured. So while Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons, and this is something that I'd like to sort of remind everyone about what happened in Syria. In Syria, there were a few cases of chemical weapons used or allegedly used, and in each of those cases, and I know that in Gray Zone this has been discussed extensively, but I just want to repeat for those who may not know that every time during these few occasions the chemical weapons were used or allegedly used, because in the last case there probably wasn't an attack at all, but they took place when the Syrian government was gaining ground and when they had absolutely no incentive to use chemical weapons. So every time chemical weapons were used, they were used or they were allegedly used in a way in which actually benefited the extremist opposition that was fighting against the Syrian government, because the Americans came in and used missiles to strike Syrian government positions. So whereas in Syria, this whole hoax of the government using chemical weapons there are only a handful of cases, and they were, except for the first, very limited in scope, if they existed at all, in the last case, in particular. But in Iran, chemical weapons were used hundreds of times and very extensively. Iraqi fighter jets would come and bomb and bomb and bomb. Then artillery thousands of people died. Many thousands of people died. I went to the town of Halabja in Iraq right after chemical weapons were used in that town, where over 6,000 women and children and men, all civilians, were murdered by Saddam Hussein. Those weapons were provided to him by the Europeans, by Western countries, and there was absolutely no condemnation. So when they speak about weapons of mass destruction, as Gareth pointed out, these attacks were being carried out against Iranians, against Iraqis, and it was in this context that Ayatollah Khomeini said, under no circumstances will I allow you to develop chemical weapons to use in the war. And as I said, during the last 3 decades, the nuclear weapon hoax that is being promoted, and again, I just like Max's book back there, The Management of Savagery, which is a very good book to read. Gareth has a very good book on Iran's nuclear program called that's the book. If Gareth has his book somewhere around, it's Manufactured Crisis. It's a very good book on the Iranian nuclear program. There is absolutely no evidence to show that Iran was actively developing a nuclear weapon. So, but this was used as an excuse to corner Iran, to hurt Iran, to punish Iranians. Just like human rights, just like terrorism, Iran is guilty of everything. Assassinations take place in Iran. Terrorist attacks are carried out in Iran. The EU did not condemn this attack yesterday. They did not condemn it. No one condemned it in Europe or the United States. So, and even now, these human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, right now the people who helped Saddam use chemical weapons against me, they are alive in the United States. They're alive in Europe. They're still in parliament, some of them. Some of them are CEOs in companies. They're around. Why don't they go and make them and their governments accountable? Because because Iran is the target, or countries like Iran, Venezuela, like Human Rights Watch, as you all know, and again, this has been covered by all of you quite extensively. The head of Human Rights Watch supported the coup in Bolivia, the takeover by the military, the myth of the fraud during the presidential election. These are the human rights organizations that we're talking about that dominate the narratives. The Western media dominates the narratives, and all of these construct these myths, and therefore, no matter what Iran does, it's simply not believed. If Gareth goes on, CNN or Fox News or NBC and says, Ayatollah Khomeini, he said you're not allowed to make new weapons of mass destruction, they say, they'd say you're talking nonsense, because the narrative is so powerful. I mean, Iran is so evil and so horrible, and people are being, according to this narrative, being suppressed and killed on the streets. I mean, it's such a horrible regime, as they like to call it, that everything is, all negative qualities are believable, and anything positive that comes out of Iran is met with skepticism, and there must be a catch to it.